The sun beat down on the parade field, casting sharp shadows on the crisp white folding chairs lined in perfect formation. A brass band stood at attention. The air smelled faintly of starched uniforms and freshly cut grass. I stood still in my dress blues, my spine straight, my chin lifted. Today was the culmination of 6 years of blood, sweat, and silence. I was being promoted to captain in front of my unit. This was supposed to be the moment I finally stepped out of the shadow of my father's name and into my own legacy. My commanding officer, Colonel Dennis, smiled proudly as he called my name. A ripple of applause echoed across the field. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. My boots felt heavy not from nerves, but from the weight of everything it had taken to get here. I turned to face my team, dozens of eyes watching me with warmth and respect. For once, I felt worthy. The colonel handed me the black velvet box. I opened it slowly, seeing the glint of silver. My new rank. My victory! But before I could pin it to my lapel, a shout cracked through the air. Traitor! The word hit me like a bullet. The air sucked out of my lungs. My body locked. That voice. I knew it. I hadn't heard it in years, but it hadn't changed. I turned my head slowly, almost unwillingly, and there he was. Walter Bishop. My father. In a faded military jacket, mouth twisted and rage eyes blazing under a weathered baseball cap. He stormed through the rows of seated soldiers, knocking over a chair as he moved. His boots stomped into the dirt like drums of war. My hands went cold. You stand there, he barked, pointing at me with shaking fingers, letting these cowards decorate you like some puppet. You betrayed everything I taught you. The colonel stepped forward, hand raised in defense. But Walter was already in front of me. He ripped the metal box from my hands with one sudden jerk. The box flew open. The insignia bounced across the dirt like a silver pebble. Walter's boot came down hard, grinding it into the earth. You think this means you're a soldier? He growled. He turned to the crowd. This is my daughter. She used to believe in this country until you people brainwashed her. 2 military police officers were already closing in, their expressions tight, professional. I stood frozen, surrounded by witnesses, rank crushed beneath his heel, childhood exposed like a raw wound. As the MPs pulled him back, Walter yelled again. You're not a captain. You're a coward with brass. Everyone was watching. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was my father's voice echoing into the still air like a curse. I did not cry. I did not flinch. But something inside me cracked, and just like that, the moment I had worked years to earn turned into a battlefield I never wanted. When I was 6 years old, I used to wait by the window every Friday afternoon, eyes glued to the driveway, hoping to see the glint of my father's truck as it turned into our cul-de-sac. He was a staff sergeant, then always wearing that brown bomber jacket boots, dusty eyes, tired but warm when they landed on me. I'd run to the door the second I heard it open, and he'd sweep me up in his arms, spinning me around like I was the only thing in the world that still made sense to him. Back then, Walter Bishop was my hero. He made grilled cheese with way too much butter. He tucked me in with stories about his deployments that he edited down to fairy tales. He used to say I had his eyes and my mother's calm. He used to tell me I could be anything, even a general, if I wanted it enough. My mother, soft-spoken and careful, was the bridge between us. She tempered his intensity, filled the house with gentle music, made sure he remembered to eat on time. She used to wrap her arms around both of us when he came home, like she was the only thing holding our world together. For a while she was. But then she got sick. It started with fatigue, then nausea, then tests. By the time the doctors said the word cancer, it was already stage 4. She didn't even last the full year. The night she died, my father didn't cry. He sat in the dark corner of the hospital room, staring at the linoleum floor like it had betrayed him. I remember reaching for his hand, and he pulled it away. That was the first time I felt like an outsider in my own family. The funeral was cold and colorless. He didn't hold my hand. He didn't speak. When we got home, the house felt like it had swallowed its own warmth. He started closing doors, hers first, then mine. His grief didn't look like sadness. It looked like silence, discipline, and control. At first, I tried to be good. I cleaned my room without being told. I did my homework twice. I said yes, sir, and no, sir, even when he wasn't looking. But it didn't matter. The hugs disappeared. The bedtime stories turned into curfews and commands. I stopped waiting at the window. He started checking my grades with military precision, correcting my posture at dinner, criticizing the tone of my voice when I asked questions. When I cried, he told me to toughen up. When I asked about Mom, he said she's gone. Focus on what's still here. I was 12 the first time he called me a failure. I had come home with a B+ in algebra. I stood in the kitchen holding the report card like a confession. He didn't yell, didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at me like I was someone else's kid and said, "Your mother would be ashamed of you." That night, I cried into my pillow, biting the fabric to muffle the sound. That was the night I promised myself I would never let him see me cry again. Over the years, the distance between us became a wall. I learned to move silently to keep my head down to swallow my voice. High school was a battlefield. If I stayed out too late, he'd lock the door and make me sleep in the garage. If I brought home a friend, he'd interrogate them like they were enemy soldiers. He read my texts, monitored my internet, blocked my phone after 9 p.m. He had rules for everything. Rules about my clothes, my hair, my shoes, even how I held my fork. I wasn't a daughter. I was a cadet under surveillance. Every conversation was a power struggle. Every laugh was questioned. Every decision was second-guessed. By the time I turned 17, I had become an expert at pretending to agree, pretending to obey, pretending to be his version of me. But inside, I was collecting pieces of myself he couldn't touch. I hid poetry in the bottom of my drawer. I listened to music in the bathroom with the faucet running. I kept a notebook of all the things I'd do when I was finally free. I remember one night he came into my room drunk and brooding. He sat at the edge of my bed and stared at the wall. He told me I was his only legacy, that I'd better not waste it. Then he left, slamming the door hard enough to knock a frame off my shelf. Inside the frame was a photo of me and my mother, our cheeks pressed together laughing in the garden. The glass cracked right across our faces. I never replaced it. Looking back, I think that was the moment I stopped trying to make him proud and started trying to survive. My mother once said that love without kindness is just control dressed in Sunday clothes. I didn't understand what she meant until I lived under his roof alone. He didn't hit me not with fists, but his words left bruises I carried for years. He trained me to be strong by making me feel small, and every time I picked myself back up, I became a little more certain of who I never wanted to be. I didn't know it then, but every cold dinner, every silent ride to school, every withheld compliment was preparing me for a different kind of war, the war for my own mind. The battlefield wasn't out there. It was in our kitchen, in the hallway, in the way he said nothing when I needed him to say anything. That was the father I used to love, until he made sure I couldn't. By the time I turned 18, I had learned how to live with my father's silence, but I hadn't yet learned how to survive his control. Walter Bishop was no longer the warm man who once spun me in the air or grilled buttery sandwiches. He had become something colder, something harder, like steel forged in disappointment. He didn't yell often. He didn't have to. His rules were etched into every inch of our house. There was no music allowed in the living room, no phone calls after 8 p.m., no closed doors unless you were showering, and even then, he'd knock every few minutes if he heard nothing. My clothes were inspected before school. My text messages were read while I slept. He kept a log of every mile I drove in the old beat-up car he allowed me to use for errands. If I deviated from the plan, he'd revoke the keys for a week. He called it structure. He said it built character. What it built was fear. Not the sudden kind that makes you run, but the slow, quiet kind that teaches you to stop hoping. I wasn't allowed to apply to colleges outside of our state. I wasn't allowed to talk about joining the military because it wasn't for girls, even though he had spent my entire childhood dressing me in camo and saluting me like a joke. He wanted me to go to community college, live at home, and help with the bills. That was the extent of his vision for me. No freedom, no dreams. Just service to his house like a live-in assistant wearing his last name. When I asked if I could get a job at the bookstore downtown, he said I'd be distracted from my real responsibilities. When I asked if I could volunteer at the vet clinic, he laughed and said, "You're not built for the real-world kid. What he meant was, I'm not ready to let go of the last thing I can control, and I was done being that thing. I started hiding things from him. Nothing dangerous, just pieces of myself I wasn't willing to give up. I kept my Army recruiter's card inside the spine of a hollowed-out book on the shelf. I made calls from the school library during lunch. I printed application forms at a friend's house and mailed them in secret. I had one foot already out the door, and he didn't even know it. But the closer I got to freedom, the tighter his grip became. He started showing up at school unannounced. He made comments about the clothes I wore, saying I looked like I was asking for trouble. He timed my errands to the minute. If I came home late, even by 2 minutes, he'd lock the door and make me stand outside until he was ready to unlock it. I started sleeping with one eye open, listening for the creak of the floorboards outside my door. I never knew which version of him I'd get, the cold ghost who ignored me or the barking drill sergeant who wanted to interrogate my day. I had stopped speaking at dinner entirely. He didn't notice. One evening I asked him why he never talked about Mom anymore. His jaw tightened and he said, "Because she's not coming back and you asking about her won't change that." I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something, but I just nodded. That's what living with him had taught me. Don't react. Don't cry. Don't give him the satisfaction. But inside, I was boiling. Every word he threw at me became another reason to leave. Every door he closed became another one I was going to kick open. I had been saving every dollar from the tutoring I did on the side. I kept it in a metal box taped to the back of my closet. I had enough for a bus ticket, enough to get to the recruitment office and disappear. I just needed the right moment. That moment came 3 days after graduation. He had taken my diploma from me for safekeeping, which meant he stuffed it in a drawer and said I didn't need it hanging on my wall like some kind of trophy. That night, he came home drunk, mumbling to himself about the war, about men who didn't deserve to come back. I sat in the dark kitchen watching him sway as he tried to pour himself another drink. He looked at me and said, "You think you know the world? You think you're strong because you memorized some formulas and wrote some essays? Let me tell you something. The world chews up girls like you and spits them out with nothing left but a sob story." I stared at him, holding his gaze for the first time in months. I said, "Then I guess I better start getting chewed." That was the first time I saw fear flicker in his eyes. Not because I scared him, but because he knew he was losing control. That night, I packed my duffel bag. I waited until he passed out in the recliner, mouth open, snoring like thunder. I took my money, my paperwork, my stolen dreams, and I walked out the back door without looking back. I didn't leave a note. I didn't say goodbye. I just disappeared. For the first time in years, the silence belonged to me. The bus smelled like rubber and old French fries. I sat in the very back, clutching my duffel like it was the last piece of armor I had. Outside the window, the world blurred into motion, streetlights and shadows, gas stations, parking lots, nameless roads leading away from the only place I had ever called home and towards something I couldn't even picture yet. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. For the first time in years, I breathed without fear of who might be listening. When we reached the recruiter's office the next day, I hadn't slept a minute. My body was exhausted, but my mind was sharp. I walked in, handed them my paperwork, and said I want out. The sergeant behind the desk raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. He just nodded and started the process. I signed my name, raised my hand, and stepped into a world that would strip me down and rebuild me in its own brutal way. Basic training was pain sweat and endless repetition. But it was nothing compared to the years I had spent under my father's roof. The shouting didn't faze me. The push-ups were easier than silence. The blisters on my feet couldn't touch the bruises on my memory. For the first time, I had structure that didn't come from fear. It came from discipline, from purpose. And for the first time, I had people around me who didn't want to control me, only push me to be better. I earned my stripes like a fighter, quietly, consistently, without fanfare. Every mile I ran, every weapon I learned to fire, every code I memorized felt like a piece of armor between me and the past. I told no one about Walter. I didn't want pity. I wanted respect. But at night, in the dark bunks, when the others were asleep, I'd sometimes hear my father's voice echoing in my skull, telling me I was weak, telling me I was a traitor. I'd clench my jaw, force the voice out, and remind myself he didn't own me anymore. After training, I was stationed at a logistics base in North Carolina. I worked hard, stayed late, took on extra duties. I didn't go home for holidays. I didn't write letters. I didn't answer the few texts he sent, usually vague and sharp, like, "Don't forget where you came from," or "Your mother wouldn't approve of this circus." I deleted them. I deleted him, or at least I tried. But freedom, as I learned, isn't always immediate. Even when you run some chains, stay wrapped around your mind. I started having nightmares sitting at the dinner table while he stared through me frozen in place as he read through my journal out loud, laughing at the pieces of me I thought I had hidden. I'd wake up sweating, fists clenched, heart racing like I was still back in that house. Therapy was optional on base, but I signed up anyway. The counselor was an older woman with tired eyes and a soft voice. I didn't tell her everything, but I told her enough. I said, "He made me feel like I was only real when he was mad at me." She nodded and said, "That's how they keep control, by making you mistake pain for attention." I hated how true it felt. But she helped me see something I hadn't before, that leaving isn't the same as healing. You can escape a place, even a person, but the story still lives inside you unless you write a new one. So I started doing that. I enrolled in night classes, studied logistics and engineering. I made friends, real ones. I learned how to laugh without flinching. I started running every morning not because someone told me to, but because it made me feel light, like I was faster than my own shadow. I even started dating a fellow soldier named Cam, kind, quiet, with steady hands and a gentleness I didn't know how to accept at first. He never asked questions I wasn't ready to answer. He didn't try to fix me. He just listened. He said, "You don't have to prove anything to me. You already survived the hard part." And still, part of me didn't believe it, because Walter's voice still showed up sometimes in the pause between sentences in the silence, after applause in the mirror when I stared too long. The scars weren't visible, but they were there, etched into the way I hesitated before trusting someone, the way I flinched at unexpected praise. Then came the letter. It arrived with no return address, just my name scrawled in angry ink. Inside was a folded sheet of notebook paper with one line. "You think you're better than me now?" My chest went cold. I hadn't seen or spoken to him in years, but somehow he had found me. I didn't tell anyone. I burned the letter. I told myself it didn't matter, but deep down I knew it wasn't over. Not for him. And if I ever stepped back into his line of sight, he'd make sure I remembered exactly who he thought I was. Still, I kept going. I earned a promotion. Then another. I stood in front of rooms and gave orders. I led convoys. I built things, fixed systems, became someone people looked to in chaos. I became a soldier. I became myself. But I also knew there would come a day when he'd try to take it all away again. And when he did, I had to be ready. Not just to stand my ground, but to make sure he never stepped on it again. It was supposed to be the best day of my life. I had earned it. Every second of pain, every night spent in silent defiance of the man who raised me, every mile I'd run, every late-night study session, every wound, both visible and invisible, had led to this. I was being promoted to captain, not just as a rank, but as a recognition of everything I had fought through, everything I had become. The base was buzzing with activity that morning. The sun was high, casting long, proud shadows across the parade ground. My uniform had never felt so heavy or so perfect. The metal box had been delivered to the office the day before, my name embossed in gold lettering, the contents pristine and gleaming. A few friends from my unit had shown up early to help set up chairs, and the band was already tuning their instruments, the notes floating on the air like a promise. Cam stood beside me in his blues, smiling quietly, his hand brushing mine in subtle support. He had made me believe in safety again, and today he would witness the final distance I had put between me and the life I had escaped. The commanding officer, Colonel Dennis, was a man of few words but unshakable fairness. He'd seen me grow into the role, guided me through tough missions, and advocated for my promotion. As we went over the schedule, he patted my shoulder and said, "You earned every inch of this, Captain Bishop." And hearing my name with that title for the first time, it didn't feel like it belonged to Walter. It felt like it was mine. My soldiers began filing in their boots, hitting the concrete in unison, a sound that made my heart tighten with pride. Flags waved in the breeze. A small podium stood at the front, flanked by rows of chairs and a table holding the medals. Someone handed me a small mirror so I could double-check my cap, and for a second I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked strong, not perfect, but whole. As the audience settled, I scanned the rows and felt a strange calm settle over me. He wasn't here. Walter hadn't come. I had half expected a last-minute disruption, a mysterious figure in the back, a cold stare behind dark glasses. But there was nothing. Only my fellow soldiers, officers, and friends. That absence felt like victory. Colonel Dennis stepped up to the mic and began the ceremony. His voice was deep measured, speaking of duty, service, and honor. As he listed my accomplishments, I kept my face composed, but inside, I was glowing. Every word was another step away from the child I had once been and closer to the woman I had fought to become. And then he said it, Captain Lauren Bishop front and center. I moved with perfect precision, spine straight, chin lifted, boots firm on the ground. I stood before the colonel, hands at my side as he reached for the velvet box. He opened it with ceremony, revealing the polished insignia inside. He said, "With the authority granted to me, I present you with this symbol of your leadership." My hands reached out. Time slowed. I could hear the wind. I could hear the breath in my chest. I could feel the weight of every moment leading up to this one. And then, traitor. The sound ripped through the air like a bullet, shattering the stillness, slamming into my spine. I froze. The box wobbled in the colonel's hand. Every head turned. The applause died. My heart stopped. That voice, I knew it like a scar, knows the blade. I turned, and there he was, Walter Bishop, my father. Marching across the field like he still had authority like this was his battle to command. He wore that same worn military jacket, his hat pulled low, his face twisted in a sneer of disgust. Soldiers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether this was a scene or a threat. Cam moved toward me instinctively, but I raised a hand to stop him. Walter reached the stage in a storm of boots and silence, his eyes locked onto mine with pure venom. "You think you've earned this," he spat. "This isn't yours. You're nothing but a puppet." The colonel tried to intervene, but Walter shoved the box from his hands. The metal clattered to the ground. Gasps echoed. I stood frozen as Walter raised his boot and stomped on it, grinding it into the dirt in front of my entire unit. "You walk around here like you're something special. But you abandoned your family. You turned your back on your blood. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." I didn't speak. I didn't move. My hands clenched behind my back, nails digging into my palm. MP guards were already approaching, but he kept going. "This is my daughter," he roared, "raised her right, taught her discipline, and she ran off to be their poster girl. What would your mother say?" The moment he said her name, something cracked. My voice came out cold. "My mother would be ashamed of you." Silence dropped like a bomb. Walter flinched, just for a second. But it was enough. The MPs took him by the arms. He didn't resist. He just laughed, loud, bitter echoing. "You think they care about you? Wait until you're used up. They'll throw you away, just like you threw away me." And then, like the storm he was gone, pulled off the field, leaving behind a crushed medal and a crowd too stunned to move. The colonel picked up the medal, dusted it off, and placed it back in my hand. His voice was steady. "Captain Bishop, you may continue." I pinned the medal to my chest, steady hands, steady breath. And I saluted, not for him, not for what he tried to ruin, but for everything I had become in spite of him. The applause resumed, hesitant at first, like the room was trying to remember what it had gathered for, but I didn't hear it. My heart was thudding so loud I could barely see straight, the medal on my chest still trembling from where his boot had nearly shattered it. My throat burned not from shame, but from a scream I wouldn't let out. I held my salute until dismissed, then turned mechanically and walked back to my seat, every step deliberate, every joint stiff, like I was holding myself together with muscle memory alone. Cam reached out to touch my arm gently, reassuring, but I flinched before I could stop myself. His face softened with understanding and he backed away, giving me the space I didn't know how to ask for. I sat down as the next name was called, the ceremony continuing like a machine that couldn't be stopped. But in my mind, it had already ended. The air around me thickened. My vision narrowed. I couldn't shake the image of Walter's face red with rage, mouth twisted, eyes wild, screaming in front of everyone like he still owned me. I had imagined him doing something petty, maybe a passive-aggressive text, a snide comment online. But this was public obliteration. He hadn't just tried to ruin my day. He tried to rewrite my identity right in front of my brothers and sisters in uniform. And what made it worse, what made it unbearable, was that for a split second, just a second, I felt small again. Like that girl at the kitchen table clutching a report card waiting for his verdict. The applause echoed, the flags waved, but inside, I was folding in on myself. By the time the last name was called, my stomach was in knots. I made it through the final salute, barely. Then the ceremony ended and people began to move toward me, officers, friends, fellow soldiers, offering congratulations, concern questions, but their words bounced off me like water on armor. I couldn't absorb anything. I just nodded, smiled, thanked them over and over like a puppet stuck on repeat. Cam stood close, letting the crowd filter out. Then he leaned in and whispered, "Do you want to get out of here?" I nodded. We walked in silence to the parking lot. He unlocked the passenger door of his truck, and I slid in, fingers numb, throat tight. Once inside, I stared ahead, unblinking while the engine hummed. "Lauren," he said, voice soft, "you don't have to pretend you're okay." I shook my head. "I'm fine." "You're not." I said, "I'm fine." But I wasn't. Not even close. The second he reached out to take my hand again, everything burst. The tears came before I could stop them, hot, fast, violent. My whole body shook. It wasn't just crying. It was collapsing. Years of grief, fear, rage, and exhaustion pouring out all at once. My shoulders convulsed as I gasped for breath. Cam didn't say anything. He just let me cry. Let me shatter. Let me exist without explanation. When I finally managed to speak, the words came out broken. Why did he come? Why today? Why now? Cam said, because he knew he couldn't stop you anymore. So he wanted to ruin it. He almost did. But he didn't. I looked at him, eyes swollen. It doesn't feel like I won anything. He shook his head. You did. You stood there. You didn't run. You didn't scream. You didn't let him win. That's power. That's strength. But I didn't feel strong. I felt humiliated, exposed, violated. He had walked into my space, my moment, my community, and tried to strip me of everything I had earned. And no matter how much everyone tried to reassure me, the truth was that a piece of me still ached, still believed him, still feared him. I stared down at my medal, its surface scratched, its ribbon smudged. It felt like a metaphor for me, shiny on the outside, damaged underneath. I should have told them not to let him in, I whispered. Cam's eyes darkened. You think you're responsible for his madness. No, I should have known he'd try something. That's what abusers want, for you to always anticipate their chaos, for you to always blame yourself for what they do. I stared out the window, the clouds overhead, gray and scattered. My hands clenched in my lap. I don't want him to ever have that kind of power again. Not over my name, not over my life, not over who I am. Cam said, "Then take it back." How? He paused, then said slowly, "Make it public. Let people know what he's done, what you've survived. Take back the story." I blinked. Like, tell the unit, not just the unit. Everyone, your file is clean, your record is gold. He tried to smear you in front of your community, so don't let silence be your response. Tell the truth, and let him watch as it doesn't destroy you, it destroys him. The idea burned in my chest, the thought of standing in front of the people who respected me, not as a victim, but as a survivor, not hiding the past, but weaponizing it. Not to seek pity, but to make sure no one ever confused who I was with the man who tried to break me. I wiped my face, my breath slowed, my spine straightened. Okay, I said. I'll do it. Cam gave me a proud smile. You're damn right you will, because that day might have started as a ceremony for my promotion, but now it was about something much bigger. It was about liberation, about truth, about making sure Walter Bishop would never again mistake silence for obedience. I was done crying. Now I was ready to speak. I didn't wait long. The very next morning, I stood before the same group of soldiers who had watched Walter scream that I was a traitor, the same men and women who had seen my father grind my promotion medal into the dirt, who had looked at me with shock, confusion, sympathy, and silence. I didn't want sympathy anymore. I wanted clarity. I wanted truth. The battalion's morning meeting was supposed to be a routine briefing, logistics updates, schedule tweaks, security rotations, but I had requested 5 minutes to speak. Colonel Dennis had granted it without hesitation. He didn't ask what it was about. He just looked me in the eye and said, "Take your time, Captain." That alone almost broke me. Not because he pitied me, but because he trusted me. When I stepped up to the front wearing the same uniform from the ceremony, the room grew quiet. Faces turned. Conversations halted. The weight of yesterday still hung heavy in the air, unspoken but undeniable. I let the silence settle for a few seconds, then began. What happened yesterday was not just a disruption. It was a window into something I've carried with me my entire life. My voice was steady. Not loud, not shaking, just deliberate. The man who interrupted my promotion ceremony was my father, Walter Bishop, a former Marine. A man who believes control equals love and violence equals strength. He taught me how to use a knife before he taught me how to tie my shoes. He taught me how to shoot before he ever hugged me. If you think what you saw yesterday was extreme, I want you to know it wasn't new. It was simply the first time he did it in public. The room didn't move. No one whispered. No one blinked. Growing up, I learned to walk on eggshells. Not because I was fragile, but because he was explosive. I lived under surveillance in my own home. Every word, every step, every decision monitored and corrected. When I said I wanted to join the military, he told me I was a joke. When I left home, he told me I was a disgrace. And yesterday, when I finally earned the rank he never thought I could achieve, he called me a traitor. My chest rose and fell. The air was heavy, but I owned it. I'm not sharing this for sympathy. I'm sharing it because silence is how abusers win. Silence lets them shape the story, and I'm done letting him shape mine. A few heads nodded slowly. Cam stood at the back, arms folded, eyes locked on me with that steady gaze that had anchored me through the worst of it. I went on. Walter Bishop doesn't represent the military. He doesn't represent strength. He represents fear disguised as fatherhood. He represents a man so threatened by my independence that he tried to destroy it, even if it meant humiliating himself in front of people he once claimed to respect. And I won't carry his shame anymore. I've carried enough. My hands unclenched. I could feel the last of the chains breaking. I'm proud of my service. I'm proud of this rank. And I'm proud of surviving something many of you may quietly understand, but rarely name family abuse, emotional manipulation, and the scars no uniform can cover. I paused. The silence was electric now, not out of discomfort, but reverence. If any of you have lived through something like this, if you've hidden parts of your past because you feared it would make you look weak, I want you to know survival is not weakness. Speaking is not weakness. Truth is not weakness. It's armor. A murmur of agreement passed through the room. A soldier near the front, Rodriguez, I remembered, wiped at his eye. I continued. I will be filing an official report and request for a no-contact order with the base. He will not be allowed near this facility again. This is no longer just personal. It's professional. It's about setting the line between discipline and abuse, between strength and domination. I stepped back, letting my words land. Thank you for listening. That's all. I didn't expect what came next. It started with a single clap, then another. Then the room erupted into full applause, not out of pity, but solidarity. A roar of approval that made my skin tingle, not because I needed their validation, but because it was the sound of a truth that had landed where it needed to. Colonel Dennis stood and walked up beside me. He didn't say much, just nodded and said, "That took more courage than most battles I've seen." Then, as the crowd slowly dispersed, soldiers came up one by one. Some shook my hand, others said nothing but met my eyes with knowing looks as if to say, "I've been there too." A few shared fragments of their own stories: strict fathers, abusive uncles, alcoholic mothers, cold homes masked as perfect ones. And suddenly, I wasn't alone anymore. I had cracked something open, not just for me, but for others. And it wasn't just cathartic, it was revolutionary. That night, I sat with Cam on the balcony outside my barracks, a blanket over our legs and warm coffee in hand. "You were incredible," he said. I shook my head gently. I was honest. "Same thing," he replied. "What now?" I asked, voice quiet. "You mean besides changing lives and scaring every controlling parent within 100 miles? I smiled for the first time that day. "Yeah, besides that." Now he said, leaning in close, "You take a breath, and you get ready for what comes next, because you just lit a fire." And I knew he was right. The war with Walter wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everything he represented, and I wasn't done fighting. Not by a long shot. It started with a call from the base legal office 2 days after the ceremony. "Captain Bishop, we've reviewed your formal statement and the footage from the promotion event. Your father's actions constitute grounds for an immediate trespass order. Effective today, Walter Bishop is permanently barred from this installation and any affiliated military premises." The words didn't feel real at first. I repeated them in my head like a chant. Permanently barred. No more surprise appearances. No more watching my back during public events. No more fear that he'd show up sneering and spitting poison in front of my peers. It was the first real wall between us, and it felt solid. But that wasn't the end of it. The video of the promotion ceremony, someone had recorded it from the back row, capturing everything: Walter's entrance, his shouts, his stomp on the metal, and my silence. Somehow it leaked online. Within 24 hours, it was on Reddit, TikTok, and military forums across the country. "Ex-Marine humiliates daughter at Army promotion ceremony," one headline read. "Abuse in uniform, when blood turns toxic," said another. The clip went viral not just because of the spectacle, but because of what I did after: my speech, my call for honesty, my rejection of shame. Thousands of comments flooded in: veterans, survivors, even former military children who had buried their own stories of abuse. They weren't praising the drama, they were thanking me for speaking, saying I gave words to what they'd carried in silence for years. And then came the investigations. Walter had long left the service, but the Marines quietly reopened several past complaints filed against him, complaints that had been ignored or handled internally at the time. Most were old, a few were deeply troubling. Physical aggression, coercive behavior, allegations from subordinates, and even one junior officer who claimed Walter had groomed an entire unit with fear. Suddenly, he wasn't a decorated ex-Marine anymore. He was a walking liability. Military publications that had once quoted him for tough love parenting now erased his interviews. His honorary speaker invitations canceled. A major veterans nonprofit he used to volunteer for issued a statement: "We stand firmly against all forms of domestic abuse and emotional manipulation, particularly within military families. Mr. Bishop's actions violate the values we uphold." Walter tried to fight back. He released a statement on some fringe blog. "My daughter is weak. She was always weak. That ceremony was a disgrace." But no one listened. Not anymore. The story had shifted. His name, once met with respect in certain circles, now carried a bitter aftertaste. Even his old unit, the one he used to brag about, issued a quiet internal memo distancing themselves. Meanwhile, I kept working. I kept leading. I refused to let the media circus distract me from what mattered: my soldiers, my unit, my mission. But something had shifted. People looked at me differently now. Not with pity, with something closer to awe. Not because I had survived, but because I had stood up. And with that shift came an invitation. The Department of Defense reached out someone from the Family Advocacy Program. They asked if I'd consider speaking on a panel about generational trauma in military families. I hesitated at first. The idea of sharing more of reliving the scars publicly made my stomach twist. But then I thought about the inbox messages I'd received. One from a 20-year-old ROTC cadet who wrote, "I didn't even realize my father's behavior wasn't normal until I watched your speech. You saved me." Another from a retired sergeant major I served 30 years, but your 10 minutes in that room did more to shake my silence than 3 decades of therapy. So I said yes. I flew to D.C. in my service dress uniform and sat on that stage under bright lights looking out at a room full of military leaders, family counselors, and survivors. When it was my turn, I didn't read from a script. I spoke from the wound. You can't expect soldiers to give their lives to their country if they spend their childhoods learning to survive their own homes. Discipline isn't control. Toughness isn't cruelty. If we want better soldiers, we need to build better families. The room erupted, and afterward, people lined up not to shake my hand, but to tell their stories. I realized I had become more than a symbol. I was a mirror. I was a voice. I was a reminder that even the fiercest soldier could come from the darkest place and still choose light. As for Walter, the last I heard, he had moved to a trailer park in Florida, alone, bitter. No one from the family spoke to him. A distant cousin messaged me. "He keeps saying you ruined him." I just smiled and said no. "She finally finished what you started." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. His silence was louder than anything I could have written. What he didn't know, what he could never understand, was that this wasn't about revenge. It was about release. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. And there is no punishment more severe for a man like Walter than watching the daughter he tried to break rise, speak, and inspire thousands without ever needing his name again. For the first time in years, I felt what peace might actually feel like. Not the fake calm that comes from pretending nothing's wrong. Not the brittle stillness of walking on eggshells. Real peace, the kind that hums low and steady beneath the surface even on hard days. It didn't arrive all at once. Healing never does. It came in fragments. Small quiet moments that slowly rewrote my nervous system. Like the first time I heard a loud noise and didn't flinch. Or the first time someone raised their voice and my body didn't instantly brace for violence. It came in mornings where I made coffee without scanning the room. In showers where I didn't cry. In long runs where I felt strong instead of chased. Cam was there for most of it, but he didn't try to fix me. He just made space. Sometimes that looked like holding me when the nightmares came. Other times, it meant knowing when to give me silence, when to leave a plate of food outside my door and not ask questions. We didn't define our relationship right away. We didn't need to. There was no pressure, no timeline, just safety, just presence. And that was enough. For the first time, I started doing things just for me. I bought a journal, not a military-issued notebook, but a soft-covered one with flowers on it, something I would have never allowed myself before. I started writing down dreams I'd long buried. Ideas, memories, feelings, rage, gratitude. Every entry peeled back another layer of armor. I signed up for a ceramics class off base. The first time I touched the clay, my hands shook. I wasn't used to creation. I was used to defense. But molding that lump of earth into something that could hold water, it felt like a metaphor for everything I was doing internally. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was shaping a new life. One night, I found an old picture buried in the bottom of my locker. It was of me at 17 standing next to Walter in full uniform, eyes wide, smile forced. I stared at it for a long time. At the girl who didn't know yet that love wasn't supposed to hurt, that family wasn't supposed to demand your silence, that obedience isn't the same as loyalty. I didn't rip the photo. I didn't burn it. I slid it back into the journal with a note, "I forgive you for believing him," because that's where real healing began, not in vengeance, not in proving anything to Walter, but in grieving the version of myself that had to endure him. I forgave her. I thanked her. And I let her go. Around that time, Colonel Dennis invited me to mentor a new batch of officers, young, ambitious, full of ideals and questions. I said yes. And every week I stood in front of them and taught not just leadership tactics, but truth. I taught them that strength wasn't loud. That real authority came from integrity, not intimidation. That the most dangerous kind of violence wasn't always physical, it was the kind that makes you doubt your own reality. One day after class, a young lieutenant barely 22 approached me. "Ma'am," she said, "I watched your video from the ceremony. I joined because of it." I blinked. "You what?" "Yeah, I was going to drop out of ROTC. My dad's like, well, kind of like yours. I didn't think I was cut out for this. But then I saw you, and I realized I didn't have to be like him. I could be like you." That hit harder than anything Walter had ever thrown at me, because this ripple effect was the real revenge. Not punishment, but proof. Proof that his cruelty hadn't defined me, that I had broken the cycle, that the next generation of women in uniform might grow up with a different blueprint, not one of fear, but of fierce, vulnerable, unshakable truth. I started getting letters, emails, messages from strangers. Some were survivors, some were soldiers, some were both, one from a Navy wife. "You helped me walk out. I left with just a backpack and my son. But I left." Another from a retired colonel, "I kept your speech on my desk, for when I forget that empathy is strength." And one from a civilian I never served. "But I had a father like yours. Your story made me feel seen for the first time." Each word was a stitch sewing my spirit back together. I still had bad days. Triggers. Moments where the past flared up like an old wound in bad weather. But I wasn't ashamed of those days anymore. They didn't mean I was broken. They meant I was healing. And healing isn't linear. It's a spiral, sometimes forward, sometimes back, always deeper. One night I sat on the roof of the barracks with Cam, the stars thick above us. I turned to him and said, "Do you think he still watches me?" Cam shrugged. "Probably. Men like him always look over their shoulder." I nodded. "Good. Let him watch." Because I wasn't hiding anymore. Not from him. Not from my story. Not from myself. I had been forged in fire, but I was no longer trapped in the flame. I was walking through smoke into something cleaner, softer, stronger. Not the soldier Walter wanted. The woman he could never break. And every step I took now, it was mine. It was raining the day I visited Mom's grave, a soft, persistent drizzle that soaked through my uniform but didn't chill me. I stood beneath the crooked oak tree by her headstone, the same one I used to visit as a teenager back when Walter's fists were still frequent and her absence still fresh. Her name was etched in simple script, no titles, no decorations, just Margaret Lynn Bishop. Loved fiercely. I knelt slowly, placing a fresh sunflower at the base. "I made it, Mom," I whispered, voice cracking. Not just the rank, the peace. I made it all the way out. For years I'd blamed her for staying, for letting it happen, for not running when she had the chance. But standing there now, I saw her differently. She had endured. She had shielded me in ways I hadn't understood until much later. Maybe she hadn't been strong in the way I needed, but maybe strength looked different when you were trapped in someone else's war. I touched the cold stone and closed my eyes. "I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. The sky didn't clear, but my chest did. I rose and walked back to the car, the rain washing over me like absolution. That same week, the Army invited me to a national leadership symposium in Colorado. They wanted me to speak not just about trauma, but about transformation. My talk was titled "Strength Reimagined Leading with Truth." I stood in front of generals, commanders, new recruits, and retired veterans. I told them everything. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't protect the image of the perfect military family. I talked about control silence, generational pain, and I talked about reclamation, what it meant to build a new legacy out of the rubble of the old. Afterward, a brigadier general approached me, white hair, steely eyes, Vietnam ribbons on his chest. He gripped my hand and said, "You've done more to redefine command than any manual we've published." That night, Cam met me at the hotel with champagne and a quiet smile. We didn't need words, just warmth, just breath, just knowing we had both survived our own storms and somehow found each other in the wreckage. A month later, I received word that my name was being submitted for early consideration for major. It wasn't just performance, it was impact. My work had sparked new conversations on base about abuse reporting, family support, and trauma-informed leadership. I had taken my deepest wound and used it to protect others, and now I was being recognized not for enduring pain, but for transforming it. My new platoon had a tradition on Sunday's team breakfast, followed by one person sharing a lesson learned outside of combat. When it was my turn, I brought an old photo, the one of me at 17 beside Walter. I passed it around and said, "This girl thought she had to earn love by surviving cruelty. She was wrong. She had to unlearn that." And she did. They listened in silence. One private wiped a tear. Another nodded slowly. No one spoke for a while. Then quietly, one of the corporals said, "That explains why you lead the way you do." And maybe that was it. Maybe legacy wasn't about medals or speeches. Maybe it was how people felt in your presence. Safe, seen, heard, understood. A few weeks later, I got a message from a woman I didn't recognize. Her name was Dana. She said she was Walter's niece, my cousin. She wrote, "I left my husband last month. He was starting to act like Uncle Walt. Your story gave me the courage. I'm free now. Thank you." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed, "You saved yourself. I'm just glad I could help." That night, I opened my journal and wrote one final line under the entry titled Promotion Day. I wrote, "He tried to define me in front of everyone, but I showed them and myself who I really am." I closed the book. I didn't need to write more, not because the story was over, but because the page had turned. My life no longer orbited around Walter Bishop. I no longer introduced myself as the girl with the angry father, the bruised past, the quiet trauma. I was Captain Lauren Bishop, survivor soldier leader, a woman who had broken every chain, every silence, every cycle. My story had gone from whispered secrets to shouted truth to living proof. And now, with every step forward, I wasn't just healing, I was building. A new family chosen, a new mission personal, a new legacy loud and lasting. I looked at my reflection in the mirror one morning before formation. Strong stance. Clear eyes. No tremble in the hand pinning the new medal on my chest. The past was part of me, but it wasn't the loudest part anymore. I saluted my reflection, smiled, and walked out into the sun.